All right, hello everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Amanda Click. I'm the outgoing chair of the ACRL Instruction Section Inclusive Pedagogy Committee, formerly known as the Instruction for Diverse Populations Committee. I just wanted to take a second to welcome you to the second session in our two-part webinar on Indigenous and Native librarians and students. Along with the Library Marketing and Outreach Interest Group, we are delighted to sponsor this event. So now I'm going to hand it off now to Carlos, our excellent moderator.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. So I'd like to introduce you all to the second part of our instruction and outreach services for diverse populations, Native American, Indigenous librarians and students. First off, I'd like to introduce our speakers. So we have Carrie Cornelius, Prairie Band, Potawatomi, and Oneida Tribe of Wisconsin. She's the acting supervisory librarian at the Haskell Indian Nations University. Second, we'll have Kevin Brown, the Dene Nation from Chinle, Arizona program specialist. He's at the Indigenous Nations Library Program, College of University and Libraries and Learning Sciences at the University of New Mexico. And finishing up, we'll have Naomi Bishop, Akimel Otham, Pima Gila River Health Sciences Library, University of Arizona College of Medicine, Phoenix. I do want to point out one thing. Today's speakers, you may hear us using the terms Native American, Indigenous, tribal peoples almost interchangeably. It's important to note that these do carry different meanings, but for the purposes of today's presentation, you may hear them interchangeably. If you have any questions, we'll be having a quick Q&A at the end, and thank you for your attention. Carrie, are you ready? How about you, Carrie, can you unmute yourself and then I'll advance the slides.
Here.
All right.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. So we'll begin with the land acknowledgements. We'll move on to Indigenous information literacy, student success, and arts and culture. All right, Carrie, it's up to you now.
Thanks, Carlos. Sagole, Bojo, hello everyone. Panikeoso, Desnakas. My name is Carrie Cornelius, and I'm with Haskell Indian Nations University, and welcome to Tammany Library. My mother is Prairie Band Potawatomi, and my late father is Oneida, one of the Haudenosaunee Longhouse tribes of the Northeast. I'm here to visit with you about land acknowledgements, and we will look at what they are, where they fit in on a continuum of healing, and some tips for creating and conducting them. I would like to begin today with an appropriate example of Indigenous protocol of my Haudenosaunee people, the Gainananyu, the words that come before all others. I will read a small part of a larger address that begins all formal gatherings such as ceremonies, weddings, seasons, celebrations, graduations, and meetings such as this. The purpose of the Gainananyu is to bring all minds together in a gracious state of thankfulness. The people. Today we have gathered and we see that all the cycles of life continue. We've been given the duty to live in balance and harmony with each other and all living things. So now we bring our minds together as one as we give greetings and thanks to each other as people. Now our minds are one. The Gainananyu continues to appreciate the plant foods, the plant medicines, trees, animals, moons, and stars, while continually bringing our minds together as one. The Gainananyu address parallels a growing protocol or practice in universities and academic libraries, the land acknowledgement. Carlos, could you turn this live? If you're at a university or academic library created a land acknowledgement, perhaps you could share your statement on the comments. And this may help some of you that are beginning yours or revisiting yours. What is a land acknowledgement? According to Northwestern University, a land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. The purpose of this socio-political statement is to address the ongoing and historical issues related to the colonization of tribal lands. The goal is to prepare a group to reflect upon their intentions, their actions, and their impacts on Indigenous communities. I enjoyed Northwestern University's not only because it has my Potawatomi tribe and Odawa Friends tribe, but provides even some posters in PDF and PNGs, which we can easily incorporate into our websites. Let's look at where the land acknowledgement fits in a path of healing. Slide, please. This slide holds a lot of emotion, so let's save our comments to the end on this one. And you can see how it starts from the bottom and goes up in an elevation. So you might envision this as a scale. And but continually think about where your library fits in on these practices. The land acknowledgement is just a step in the scale. You can see it towards the middle. The land acknowledgement is one of many steps. And in this continuum, it starts with a violation, an acknowledgement of the violation, reconciliation, and hopefully we'll get to coexistence, a peaceful, happy coexistence. Here's a quick analogy of this violation and this path to coexistence. Pretend someone violated you by stealing your car. They acknowledge the act by driving around the block and thanking you for your car. They begin to reconcile their act by providing you rides in their car. And lastly, they make amends to create a peaceful coexistence. What would that look like with your car? And what would that look like within academic libraries? At the bottom, we begin with the most painful step of the journey, the violation, and recognizing that Indigenous people have been violated by Western education in many ways in our histories, and sometimes still now. Indigenous peoples have been violated not only in space or acquisition of their lands, but by values placed on epistemologies. Academic systems value Western scientific knowledge, not traditional knowledge systems such as experiential knowledge. On the next step, acknowledgement of the violation. This is where the land acknowledgement fits in. We can also see changes in hiring practices and establishing diversity, equity, and inclusion committees and trainings. Is your library staff racially representative of your community served? Are you retaining your people of color? Or are they passing in and out of your doors? The next step, the move toward reconciliation. Does your library offer Indigenous safe digital and physical spaces? Is there a space that our students can come in and recognize that this is their space? Where are your books with content on Indians of North America? Are they all in history? You might want to do some collection analysis and see where they fall. Make changes in collection development policies to purchase content written by Indigenous authors. Tell publishers and databases to purchase and value articles and research using Indigenous methodologies. And if you need more ideas, you can look north to Canada, because Canada is really moving with their reconciliation. You can see Camille Callison's work in her work with the Truth and Reconciliation Report and recommendations. And there's lists, just lists of what can happen in there. And our fourth step at the top, that peaceful coexistence. What would it look like in your library where all cultures are safe and celebrated? And I could just hear that laughter. Carlos, could you turn that slide? The University of Alberta's Library and Information Studies Students Association has an incredible document, the LISA Land Acknowledgement Template for Personalization, Definitions, and Speaker Protocol. And I've taken some of these tips from this, and I encourage you to go there and try it out. Created just last March, this document explains why land acknowledgements are so difficult to create. The work is personal and the work is uncomfortable. Your equilibrium is out of place where learning takes place, like we ask many of our students to be. The work requires practice pronouncing words you're not used to. The work is not the work of Indigenous people. So having people work on it's real common to have a university find the Indigenous people and tell them to make it. It's not their role to do that. They might be on a committee to correct this. We would like to thank everybody who has done this hard work, not only for a checkbox for the university. We don't want it to be a checkbox for the university, but something personal, something that's revisited. Your land acknowledgement is a living document that acknowledges issues, the current issues where improvements can happen. Thank you for your time today. And now we're going to move from Haskell Indian Nations University to the University of New Mexico, to Kevin Brown's work with Indigenous Information Literacy. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you, Carrie, for that wonderful presentation and setting up the framework for the rest of the presentation that myself and Naomi will follow. I think it is important to acknowledge the history and the current policies which impact Indigenous students and faculty in higher education. As you recall, in part 1 of this webinar, I presented on a theoretical perspective called Indigenous Critical Consciousness. Today, I'm going to present on a practical approach of achieving that goal of transforming students to be confident and competent students. This portion of my presentation will consist of my development of Indigenous information literacy and the pilot curriculum of the Indigenuity workshops to apply the definition. I want to start this presentation to remind you of an important perspective from an Indigenous student at UNM. As you recall, my program created a photo contest of how they would indigenize UNM, and this entry that you see was a winning entry. And the last sentence of the photo narrative is where I want all of you to reflect upon. We are bringing home with us. We are bringing ceremony to our studies. The reason they are bringing home with them is they are coming from a unique Indigenous lifestyle, which brings upon it a way of living, a way of understanding the world around them, which has a whole new set of different principles, values, histories, knowledge, and information networks. This simple sentence opened up a realm of possibilities for me to acknowledge and to develop this Indigenous information literacy approach to nurture Indigenous students to interface their own Indigenous way of life with that of the academic network. Slide, please. To begin, I want to present a draft definition of what Indigenous information literacy is in comparison to the ACRL information literacy framework. This definition is a quote from page 8 of the framework of information literacy in higher education document, which was adopted by the ACRL board in January 2016. Compared to the definition I introduced, which was influenced from interactions with students and my professional and academic training as an archaeologist, museum technician, and now a program administrator of a library program. I welcome comments, suggestions, and questions to this draft definition. And then the definition that I've drafted goes as follows. Indigenous information literacy is a set of ancestral and learned abilities of understanding the ecological relationship with information, the understanding of how information is transmitted intergenerationally, produced and valued, reinforces identity, embedded in physical landscape, and philosophically understood for the use of communities in practice. So what types of information do Indigenous students bring with them onto campus? Slide, Carlos. This slide represents my initial thoughts about Indigenous information, and they are, first, Indigenous information is derived from the land, and individuals are interacting with them in their everyday life. Because the land is a constant reality for many living organisms, including humans, information derived from the land is constant. It is constant. It can change, but overall land-based information is an ongoing phenomena. Second, observing that information is empirical. Information is perceived and encountered by human sensory experiences in direct and indirect transmission modes. I will explain later in the presentation what this means. Third, information is integral in knowledge production, meaning information is verified and processed for utility in the community for informed action. Also, information is differentiated between different age members of a community. Indigenous information is important for younger people in their formative years, but diminishes in relevance among older individuals because they have characterized that information into knowledge. This is why elders in a community are so important and vital in a community, because they have encountered all knowable information, and they are living archives of knowledge, which is important for intergenerational learning and community survival. Fourth, the community impacts the spread rate of information, which is also known as diffusion. The spread rate is dependent on the size of the community, which I call the information diffusion rate. Obviously, smaller the community, the quicker the spread of information and more uniform, whereas a larger community may have a slower spread of information and less uniformity depending on that community organization. Fifth, Indigenous information is influenced by human agents because it is sensitive to that individual's interpretation, which is also totally dependent on that individual's empirical observations. Finally, the interpretation of information is totally dependent on the culture of that human agent. The information cultural environment can impact the spread or restriction of information. For instance, cultural restrictions such as taboos can stop the spread of information, and cultural acceptance and approval of information promotes information distribution. Slide. All of my key ideas related to Indigenous information also inform and transform into Indigenous knowledge. First, knowledge is derived from Indigenous information. Those ecological land-based information pathways is processed by the community to apply them for community survival and growth. A good example of this is the process of domestication, such as teosinte, which is a grass, which has been modified over time by human engineering and human ingenuity into what we now call corn. And then second, human agents transmit knowledge in various direct and indirect pathways. Transmission of knowledge can very much be an intimate personal learning environment or the use of cultural learning tools to archive and promote knowledge. The next slide will explain more about what this looks like. Knowledge systems are extremely sensitive to outside influences, especially violent and epidemic situations, because human agents are the primary carriers of knowledge and are extremely vulnerable. A real world example of this is going on right now with COVID-19 impacting my Navajo community and my Navajo people. The loss of life in my community also means the loss of understanding, Indigenous information, and the Indigenous knowledge that comes with those elders in that community. And we have seen the rates of infection and the loss of life in my community, and my heart hurts for that because all of that personal knowledge and all that personal information is lost with them. Fourth, similar to cultural influences of information and interpretation, knowledge is interpreted culturally and reinforced as tradition over time. Furthermore, knowledge is dependent on several cultural contexts that promote community knowledge, relational knowledge, or gender knowledge. And finally, the learning environment of Indigenous knowledge can be characterized as personal and intimate. For instance, most learning is applied through personal apprenticeship or in personal familial settings, compared to learning in an academic institution, which is based on classroom instruction and reading content and information from books. Restrictions of knowledge can be subject to community values, norms, familial relationships, and possibly gender norms. Slide. I created this matrix to understand the relationship of indirect and direct transmission on Indigenous information and knowledge. Indirect transmission is not directly observing information or knowledge, but encountering the transmitted activities. And direct transmission is directly observing information and learning Indigenous knowledge and consuming all context available within that. As here you can see in the matrix, Indigenous transmission of Indigenous information could be perceived as signs, cultural symbols and motifs, and human community observances. Again, this is not, the definition goes with indirect transmission is that you're not directly observing it, so you're probably looking at the remnants of that direct observation. Whereas direct transmission of Indigenous information is you personally or firsthand observing these phenomena or information sequences in play. And these include your own sensory experiences, observing seasonal observances, participating ecologically in these pathways, looking at the astronomical cycles, which are lunar, solar, and celestial, observing plant and animal rhythms, and then also interacting first-person and human community interactions. Whereas indirect transmission of Indigenous knowledge could be perceived to be encountering artifacts, observing rock art, and also recalling your own memory, potentially your own memory. And indirect transmission of Indigenous knowledge could be that first-person interaction through storytelling, language communication, observing presentations, dances, ceremonies, and then and also apprenticeship experiences. Now, these are my initial thoughts of what indirect and direct transmission appears to be, and I am still reflecting on indirect transmission because it is a dynamic, process. Individually, we encounter information and knowledge in our own lives, and we have varied responses to them. Also, the interpretation and learning environments or the communities we belong to are very diverse. So this matrix may be different in your own community versus mine. Slide. What I presented thus far have been theoretical and conceptual. Now I want to transition to curriculum that I developed for Indigenous information literacy. End result is our indigenuity workshops. The following topical workshops I'm going to discuss are designed thematically to reinforce cultural identity and interfaces with Western academic standards of objective research. Each of the workshops discussed below are dialogue-centered. The goal of discussions for the workshop is for participants to bring their own lived experiences, bring their own Indigenous identity, their own Indigenous experiences for them, and then to personalize their own content for their own learning benefit. That's a big key with this Indigenuity workshops. The first workshop, which starts in the upper left, is Personal Information Network. Personal Information Network is a workshop designed to identify information networks, whether it is a family, personal, community, cultural, and scholarly. Participants will be asked to identify important information channels that will be beneficial for learning, studying, and research. The goal is to contextually center their own personal information channels for points of complementary intersection of information exchange. One of the activities we do is called an Indigenous information mapping exercise, where they would map their own information channels coming to them and also from them, because human agents interact with information direct to them and also from them. The second one is what I call ancestors' consciousness and research. This workshop is designed for students to connect to their ancestral ideas and methods to use today. This workshop asks participants how their own ancestors perceived information. In addition, participants will imagine how their ancestors perceived and archived information as a point of reference for their own action preparation, planning, and application in their lives. The idea is to continue their ancestral traditions and interface them with other Western methods in a holistic manner. And one of the exercises we do here is called the thought experiment and using meditative practices. The next workshop is called imaginative research. Participants will imagine an intellectual arena where their personal ideas and knowledge will be activated to address research inquiry. They will envision and design their research perspectives. That includes encountering a variety of information and resources. As an activity, participants will prototype their ideas in a creative fashion by using part of their brain power that is underutilized and imagining them into reality. Again, coming from Indigenous learning perspective, we're using all facets of our human ability, and that includes storytelling, language communication skills, and using other creative aspects to that. Whereas in Western academic settings, it's mainly based through instruction and reading materials. Here, I want to interface them and bring all facets of their brain power in this workshop. And one of the activities we do is what I call a creative research matrix. which is using all creative elements to explore their own theory, methods, and case study for their own research design. And this includes, I've had students write poems related to the research, draw the research. Others did spoken word. Others, did something creatively, and even tested their own skills in terms of thinking on the other part of their brain to maximize their own intellectual capabilities. And this one, the next one is called Textual Knowledge in Writing. The reason why it is dark colored in this slide is because this this workshop is designed to have a tangible skill set for them to use in their research, which includes writing. A lot of Indigenous students have, I wouldn't say issues with the writing, it's just that they have a conflict with their Indigenous communication styles with academic writing, which can be very dry, very static, and also coming from an objective person, an objective positionality, whereas Indigenous communication styles, you're talking from your own person, speaking from my people, speaking from myself, and those transitions change in their writing. This workshop is a reflection exercise of the differences between textual knowledge sources and other ways of knowing, including their own Indigenous ways of knowing. This comparison provides a great opportunity to explore how libraries and scholars encode knowledge into texts, while Indigenous communities do the same in cultural tools and poetics, such as songs and other, other language practices. Participants will navigate the various modes of knowledge and transfer, which includes a discussion of the syllabi, reference information, index organization systems, and primary and secondary sources. Finally, we explore the writing styles as a reflection of their own Indigenous communication styles, like I said. And what we do in terms of exercises, we do this exercise called turning low stakes writing into high stakes writing. And low stakes writing is defined as writing for yourself. So like drafting exercises, poetic poems, free writing, journaling, and taking their own low stakes writing and then turning those into high stakes writing, which they could use them, which is basically assessment writing or essays or argumentative writing. And another exercise we do is called a comparative communication diagram, which we have them map their own Indigenous communication skills versus that of their own academic discipline that they're writing to. Personally speaking, my writing style conflicted with the anthropological definition or anthropological discipline because I was writing from my own Indigenous perspective most of the time. And a lot of anthropological writing styles is very descriptive, very objectified, and it was very odd to write from my own Navajo perspective about my Navajo people and trying to be objective about that. It was very difficult to do. And I see that happening with a lot of Indigenous students at UNM. Also too, I want to also point out is that a lot of Indigenous students, when they write, they're using their own Indigenous communication skills in their writing. Similarly to how an elder is writing, or not writing, but like speaking to their community, they're using long drawn out sentences, could be tense fragments, they're mixing time in their writing, and that could be the same. And I see that also in Indigenous writing, is that they're using a lot of run-ons, fragment breaks, tense breaks. They're inserting their own positionality in the writing. It's not they don't understand writing, it's just that they're inserting their own communication skills, their own Indigenous communication skills into writing. Next workshop is what I call ethical research inquiry. Ethical research inquiry is a workshop designed to compare academic Indigenous values regarding information and knowledge responsibilities. This workshop will explore intellectual values concerning research agendas through thinking in a good way. Thinking in a good way is related to thought precede action research model approach. And the goal is for the participants to develop their own ethical guidelines for doing research in a good way. One of the approaches we use is Sean Wilson's research as ceremony approach. We follow that. And also we use literal ceremonial approaches to research activities. In Indigenous ceremonies, everything is thought out, ritualized, and everything is, I guess there's a rhyme or reason to doing things in a ceremony. And similarly to ethical research, there should be a practical and ceremonial approach to research also. Thank you for your time and attention. This concludes my portion of the presentation. I look forward to hearing from you. Next, I want to hand the presentation over to Naomi Bishop, who will discuss her teaching and Indigenous librarian experiences at her own institution. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Carrie, for setting up my talk for me, basically. This first point that I wanted to express is about dialogue and reflection. And when I was in grad school, I interned at the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., and one of our speakers, he said this, and I just wrote it down because I have kept this with me throughout grad school, is this idea of a new science. It's not simply a science of collecting and recollecting, of simply applying theories and interpretation for academic journals and audiences, but the science of dialogue and of reflecting the best of a community back to itself, of research and programming that adapts to help meet the needs expressed by communities of people. And this is Dr. Jose Barrio, who was at NMAI in the Office of Latin America. And this has stuck with me in everything that I've done since hearing this quote from him. And a couple of things that really I think that academic libraries can do to support students and to help their institutions is to really have dialogue and reflection on the protocols of Native American archives, which was developed at Northern Arizona University with a roundtable of archivists and Native communities. The Society of American Archives has adopted the protocols for Native American archives, and there are many documents in my references of many people like Jennifer O'Neill, who was my supervisor at NMAI, who have discussed and done much sharing of knowledge with working with communities in their archive collections and their special collections. Another area of dialogue and reflection, which I'm really thrilled to share with you, that I just have seen in action here in Arizona the past 2 years, has been community archives from ASU's archives. And if you haven't heard about community archives, I would really encourage you to go back and look at the community archives action that has been happening at ASU these past years, of going out into the community, looking at your own collection and seeing where are those gaps and where is there a need to understand the community's stories that have maybe not been reflected about your university or about your community that you live in. This whole idea of programming and understanding the community needs is something that we talk a lot about in libraries. But in reality, if it's actually been done, or if it's been done correctly, I think there's a lot that we can continue to do, especially thinking about people not being together in this time, of what you can do to bring people together online or in other ways by sharing their stories. And dialogue and reflection through primary sources, the archive, special collections, interviews, news, photos, and digital media is something that is really important to Native research. I have worked with a lot of different students in the sciences and health sciences, and it's really difficult for them to find information and data on particular tribes or particular populations. And so we usually end up trying to look through local news, local newspapers, or current initiatives, interviews with elders, things that we can kind of create research. And so there's a lot of primary research that is going on with students being able to share those stories, to create those stories, and to create that knowledge transmission from a primary source perspective. Slide, Carlos. So in addition to thinking about reflection and dialogue, I want to introduce you to a couple of things that I do with students when I teach a class. And the first one you're actually all going to participate in your chat box. I will give you about a minute. And I want to ask you 2 questions. One, where do you live? So if you would write that in the chat box. And then another one, where do we live? And just take about 30 seconds now to chat at me. Where do you live and where do we all live? I see 1, 2. Excellent. I see people from all over, and we all live on Earth. The Southwest, good, excellent. Lots of different regions. We live in the US. We live in Earth. Turtle Island, good. North America. Excellent. So all of these different responses is usually what I do go around the classroom. I live in the jurisdiction of the Sac and Fox Nation. Thank you for that one. Lots of different territories there listed. So this is an exercise to get people thinking, to get students' minds thinking, and all to understand kind of where do they individually live and where do we all live. And this works really well when you're in the classroom and we're all actually living in the same city or the same state, because then you get to expand on what county we're in or what tribal lands we are residing on. And so this is just an introduction that I do for students for them to recognize where we live and what we do. And you can see in this photo here, actually, this is a photo from my mom's backyard. Well, it's not her backyard. This was actually what they had to do before they built a house there for my grandparents. Was the tribal archaeologists had to do a environmental scan of the area, and they actually found lots of artifacts, and this is a known land of where the people have lived for thousands of years. And so it just reinforces of where we live and where we all live. And so I just think about that all the time of our students coming from wherever they come from, but also where we are all living together. And then another strategy that I do for talking about searching is an example for Native Americans. And in Arizona, this is actually great to do with your students because it really tests their knowledge about their population and their community. So I asked them, what are other words for Native Americans? What are some similar terms that you would search for Native Americans? So you'll get your Indians of North America. But then it really stretches the students' minds to think about what does Native Americans mean? Is it all one people? Is it different people? Is it different tribes? Is it different families? Like, what does that actually mean? And when you're searching, what do you come up with? What are the results when you type in Native Americans versus Pima versus Navajo? What does that actually look like in your databases and in your online search tools? So this is a really great exercise to do with students, just to introduce them to terms and what the difference is and what you can be thinking about. Next slide, Carlos. A few other exercises that I'd like to share. One is an active learning exercise where I use note cards and colored pencils, and I'll put one generic word on the note card and then I'll pass it around for the class to write another word, but they can't use a word that another student has already used. And so I'll use words like water, health, environment, climate change, soil, ecosystems, air quality, and just see what the students come up with. And this is really getting at what they're thinking and their perspective is, because we all have different perspectives on this. But with science students, this is really fun, and with engineering students, it's really fun. Health students, because what does health mean to you, or what is another word for health if you were searching? I'll get things like nutrition, well-being, mental health, doctors, nurses, all different types of words that come in there. And it's really broad, but then sometimes there'll be really specific things like bodybuilding or a specific diet or something like that that is listed. And it's really interesting to share with students all these perspectives and all these different ways of searching and terminology and how that can matter and make a difference in what you're finding. And then the other activity that I do is an evaluation of sources. So I pre-print and bring to class usually about 10 or 15 articles or different types of materials. Sometimes it's a white paper, sometimes it's a technical report, whatever it is that I think is kind of interesting. And then I split the students up into groups and I pass out the articles. And then I ask them as a group to look at the articles and tell me 3 questions that they have about that article. I also ask them to tell me if they would trust the study that was done in the article and the methodology that was performed, why or why not. And as a group, they have to debate and understand and think about not only finding the research, but evaluating what they find, because that's when it gets interesting. That's when students, sometimes they don't know what it is because it's not a study that I've given them at all. Sometimes it's like a review article or a primary source, a patent or something, and they're like, yes, I would trust this. It was approved on the state, but really getting students to think about what they're looking at and would they use it and why they would use it, because I think it's more than just finding things, it's understanding what you're finding and really at that deep level, having that reflection and dialogue on what you are discovering. So next slide, Carlos. So my next slide is about supporting students. There are many ways you can support Native students on your campus. I've worked at many large public universities and private universities. I'm currently in a medical school, and it looks different at every university of how you would support Native students. In my current role, you'll see the top right, actually these are all from my current role, but on the top right there, you'll see a picture of 2 girls. And then we went to a high school or a local reservation community in Salt River, and we actually did a table about health information for students and parents as one of their STEM night activities. And getting out in your local community is something where if you have a Native population and you're connecting them to free resources or public information. So we were telling people, instead of searching Google, search Medline Plus, or here are some other sources where you can go. And this, I'm so proud that we did this in January, because now with the pandemic, I'm like, people know where to go. They might have a brochure or a bookmark to understand where to find reliable health information or information that's helpful for them. So that's something you can do wherever you are in the country. You can find a local community, you can find a public library to partner with, whatever you would like to do, but finding those community partners, and it really helps them. And then it also gives those young students that are K through 12 or high school students an opportunity to meet folks from the university, and the university actually gets to connect and reach out to them. So that's your future Wildcats, where I'm at. It's our future, pool of students that we're trying to share information about and share about libraries, because not every school in Arizona has a school library. And so it's really great when the academic or university can actually find an opportunity to support those teachers and communities and principals and families in your local area. Other things that I've done are bulletin boards, but I always try to mix in Native content. So there's a graphic medicine one there. There's, we do a grateful board in November of We Are Grateful. And then I have students, and this is all students, to reflect on what they're grateful for and thankful for. But then I also bring in the children's book called We Are Grateful, and let them read it or have it on the table for display so they can be exposed to other cultures and information. And then the Homelands of Arizona map that I did was to really point out to our students, like, where are all these communities? Where are all these reservations? And what type of organizations are out there that are related to health? And I'm really happy that I did this exhibit too, because now in the midst of a pandemic, I think our students have really organized to help some of these communities and to really understand what's going on and how close it is to us, and that we do have students from these communities as part of our university community. And then always do something fun. So may the scores be with you. Always something to help boost their engagement and make them happy. I did another one with the hearts. That's what makes your heart happy, and just sharing these little things. And there's a little book called My Heart Fills with Happiness that's also with Native characters that I just set out there. But just little things like that that actually engage all your students and make them understand that they're supported and encouraged. And it can be stressful in the library, but you can make it fun. Next slide, Carlos. Other things you can do to make it fun, and we've touched on some of these, but physical space, don't be afraid to start small or dream big. Family-friendly library spaces, artwork, technology, your collections, those are really important in a physical space. Even if you don't have like a lot of money, a piece of artwork on the wall can make all the difference in your library, or a table that's set aside just maybe for students, or a study room, or something that can actually help them meet other students, because I think making connections and building relationships is really important in Native communities. And if you can find other things to connect with. Food is also something we talk about, having a seed library, a community garden, cookbooks and recipes, sharing stories, oral stories and histories. That's something a library can organize and do. Relationships and finding small ways. Email students to check in. If you ever meet Native students, you can give them your card and say, hey, let me know if you ever want me to read a paper for you or provide research help for you. And just having an open door, whether it's Google or Hangouts or chat or whatever, just letting students know that you are available for them. Materials is really, really, really important, especially now, but OER textbooks, laptops, hotspot loans. I've had so many Native students come to me and say, I can't get this streaming media that my faculty member put on there for me to watch. Is there any way the library can put it on a CD or something for me to watch? And I've had to have conversations with faculty of like, we need to select other things. You can't be requiring students who don't have, you know, fast internet to be watching these digital streaming things as part of an assignment. Like, we really need to work on our equity of what you're assigning and how we can assist with the library. Creating LibGuides on Indigenous topics is a fantastic way to make your materials that you do have visible, especially online. And then building partnerships across campus. So a career center, a financial aid office, student health, housing. All of these things are things the library can be involved in spreading that information and sending that out to other networks, because information networks may look different if a student's not a part of a sorority or a fraternity or a certain club. Sometimes the information doesn't get spread around as much. And so I think the library is something that can create a community board or create some way to also send out those scholarships, send out those jobs notices to students to help them in their success. Next slide. So collection development, just think about your collections and what's that purpose and where's there room to grow. I know budgets are tight right now, so these are some areas that maybe people don't always invest in, but you should look at. And if you don't have money to build a collection, think about what you could do online with resources that are freely available. So podcasts, YouTube, different special collections that might be out there online. Think about how you can build something for your Native student population that will help them feel like they are part of your library. And in your collection development policy, also think about your purpose, and it may be also looking at materials that are older or outdated or are not so respectful. They could be different types of collections that maybe everybody says, oh, keep them for history. Well, if they're for historical reasons and there's something there that is offensive, you may have to pull that book or that report or whatever it is and put it in a safe place so that it can be, you know, in special collections, but not checked out in circulation to your whole community. Like, think about ways that you can actually understand materials that are in your collection and really do your research and your learning of how to protect that information and make it available to your communities. Next slide, Carlos. So just celebrating arts and culture is something that I think every academic library can do to support their Native students, to engage in education. There's opportunities in physical spaces to provide workshops or celebrations for Indigenous Peoples Day. Powwows are really large events. Even if they're not happening in the library, if they're happening on campus, you can get involved. The library can sponsor something or donate or show up and just participate and encourage students to participate, because every powwow that I've been to on a college campus where students go, sometimes there's a booth for the library. You can actually advertise your service to other students and to the community there. Invite Indigenous authors and filmmakers, publishers and artists, and even elders can be part of your celebrating Native arts and culture. workshops in your maker spaces. So one thing that we did was do a culture in making series up at NAU, and we actually had Native artists come in and do these workshops on Saturdays for the whole community, not just for our students, but for the whole community. We did an LSTA grant to engage our community and share this Native artist's work. So there's different things you can do in that manner. And then displays. So what would this look like post-COVID? That's a good question. But there are things that you can do in displaying information on your website and making digital exhibits maybe, or even student work, sharing and having a symposium or a research presentation or artist book club online. Ask your students what they want. That's the most important thing. If you want students to come, you need to ask students what they want and what they would go to. Would you go to this? Would this fly? They'll give you names of people that they want to see, or people that they want to meet or hear from, or a book that they want to read. Next slide. The last slide is supporting Indigenous librarianship. So there's lots of ways that you can be engaged. And one way is to partner with other organizations like the American Indian Library Association or the American Indian College Fund, and just support in ways of advocacy or fundraising. Those are both great ways to support. Hiring and mentoring Native students in your campus library. I became a librarian because I was hired on as a student my sophomore year as a transfer student, worked in the library, and realized that it was actually a great place to work, and I really enjoyed it. But hiring and retaining librarians is really difficult if you're the only one in your library representing all the Native nations and everyone has questions for you or other things. But some of the things that you have ideas for, if it's not always easy to implement them by yourself, and so you do need to work with your teams and in your organizations. Like, everything is hierarchy and structure, so you really have to work within what you can do. Working with your directors or working with other departments on campus has been a really successful way. But building relationships and helping that be the core of what you do as a library can really do amazing things for your students. And then the last thing is expand your knowledge and Indigenous knowledge and experience by reading and engaging, talking to local professors, and engaging your community. That's something that you can do as a librarian. You can go find a book list. You can go find faculty that are specialties in these areas and talk to them and learn about them and promote their research and promote them as somebody on your campus who doesn't get as much visibility or notice, but providing them an opportunity to share with the rest of campus their work or their research. So thank you, Carlos. That's all I had to share today.
Thank you, Naomi. So here's a list of our references, and we have a little bit of time, so if anyone has any burning questions, you can type them into the chat, and we'll try and make sure we can answer what we can in the time we have. And thank you to Kevin, and thank you to Carrie as well.
And I'm also going to drop in the chat a feedback form. We would appreciate it if you would complete that, and also the resource list.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Okay, okay, here's a question. So how can I, as a white woman, do more to help the Indigenous students and people? Is there anyone who'd like to handle this?
I can say there's lots of things you can do. I think one would be sharing and learning about American Indian higher education organizations. So the American Indian College Fund, the Association of Tribal Colleges and Universities. And in part one, we actually talked a lot about different organizations and places that you could go to support. So supporting them, also advocating for funding with if you live in a state and you are have your state senators and representatives, write to them and advocate them and say, hey, we need more monies for Native American health. We need more money for education for Native people in rural areas. There's a lot you can do as a citizen just to advocate for folks and for resources within your state legislature, within your senators in Congress. So voting and helping Native people in that way is a good thing to do. And your campuses, I think it's really important to kind of bring awareness to your campus history and organization. And if there are any stories, I know that I worked at the University of Denver for a couple of years and was a part of a task force about the university. And there was actually the history professors actually looked into the history of the university, and they were trying to figure out if their founder had been a part of the Sand Creek Massacre. And they did find that he was, and he played a big major role in that. And so coming to terms with that on campus is something that I think librarians can actually investigate and understand and share and know. And there's actually a couple universities that actually have looked into their histories and understood that. And just sharing of resources, support spectrum scholars through ALA and other things. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question about active learning and instruction plans, and I have a feeling this is one that a lot of people have. And another one on what ways Indigenous people have been supported in academia. So yes, there's a quick question. We will be providing a link to a recording of this presentation, but I might ask folks who do have experience sharing active learning activities in digital environments. If you have any tips, links, or best practices in the audience, feel free to post those in the group chat. But as far as our speakers, have you thought of anything?
Kahoot is a really fun one to do with my students. There's a couple other Poll Everywhere, things like that that are digital that you can actually ingrain into your digital teaching exercises is fun, but also just providing either breakout rooms, discussion rooms, or just having a discussion board. So in LibGuides, you can have a discussion board in your LibGuide embedded. So you could ask those questions that I asked within your LibGuide and then give a response or feedback to the class and say, okay, I'd like everybody to fill this out and participate there virtually. I think those are some of the easier ways to do stuff. We'll see what this fall semester has in store for all of us.
All right, and here's a question for Errol. I think I'm gonna make sure everyone gets a chance. As an Indigenous person in academia, what are some ways you were supported? How did you succeed in academia despite many barriers?
So I from my perspective, running the Indigenous Nation Library program at UNM, I think we're in a privileged position because not many universities have a physical space, a dedicated staff to work with students directly. But my suggestion is to develop your network on campus. That's one thing I always tell the students here is, who do you know in financial aid? Who do you know in advisement? Who do you know, in your academic department, your own discipline, that is a truthful ally, not someone that is there to do their job, but just someone who will guide you and engage with you, through the steps. Here at UNM, it's something I try to do with all of the students. And it's my job as the program administrator to network with all of these different departments. And I did see a question about how can a non-Indigenous person help students in that fashion. Is you can be the link for them about resources on campus too. Who are your networks on campus? If there's a American Indian Student Center, someone who works in DEI initiatives, faculty who are very, very helpful, helping students of color. I think it's really important for your non-Indigenous professionals and universities to also do the work yourself and reaching out to other departments. I think it's more pertinent now that you have to do that work for Indigenous students more, because a lot of Indigenous students are very reluctant to trust the system because, based around history with bureaucracy and other bureaucratic institutions, our trust in the system is, has failed us many times. So be that force in that student's life to do the work for them too, and also know all of the resources around you and your academic institution also. So
Great. Carrie, Naomi, do you have anything you would like to add?
I think support from non-native folks. So I've had some incredible supervisors and some great people that have really supported me and told me, you have to write, you have to publish, you have to do things. And at first I didn't believe them, but I came around and I told them I'm going to write and publish things that I really care about. And so that's kind of where I was able to then be successful in that. I think Kevin and all of us, we know like this was a platform for us to share all that we kind of do all the time. And so that's why we really wanted to be a part of this webinar. So for organizations like giving Native librarians the opportunity to speak, we really appreciate that and value that. So thank you.
I've always made it a point to be in touch with my mentors, and I was real fortunate to have people that were always available to us, and recognize that we become mentors to our students. We have students at the University of Kansas who are a very, very small percentage, and people go out of their way delivering articles to their homes. I pick up books, deliver them to their homes. We're mailing textbooks to students. Whatever, it's just being available continuously in a variety of platforms so that they're comfortable with you at any time to ask questions and ask for help.
Thank you all. I wanted to add one more thing to that question. I myself have always, there have been definite challenges when you're hearing a history that may not actually reflect what you've lived or what you know. But having faculty members who are sympathetic and have reminded me that it's okay to challenge the narratives of dominant culture, and to know that it's okay to essentially like rock the boat in the classroom, and that they have your support. And as long as you're working carefully and you can prove what you're saying, like you are able to push back and to seek improvements for both yourself and people you want to help. And finally, there were numerous questions to Kevin regarding your workshops.
So I'm revising some of the workshops now. I think there was a question about would I be willing to do this workshops. I'm adding more to the workshops because one thing I found out is that Indigenous students are doing research on Indian time. Sometimes it's very last minute, sometimes, and it's not because of their fault, it's just they have other priorities in their life too. Some are living with their grandparents, or some are home caregivers, some are single parents. It's just that their time is very, very limited throughout the day. So I'm adding another workshop related to doing research on Indian time, which is being more efficient, thinking efficiently with their research ideas, searching efficiently. That's something that librarians can do to help students, is to be more efficient with the system that we design for them. And God, it's so complicated sometimes. Sometimes we organize our information systems for ourselves much more than for the students that we serve. So navigating those information systems for students to use efficiently is something that I'm working on. But I'm open to workshops in the future. And I'm getting ready to write this whole Indigenous information literacy. I have a book manuscript, not really a book manuscript, but a chapter in a book manuscript. And I'm submitting a draft of this Indigenous information literacy approach in that, and it'll be submitted in June. So be on the lookout for potentially next year that it'll be written about. So yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, and I believe everyone's contact information is listed and in the slides, which are being shared out. I want to thank everyone for tuning in and for your questions. I want to thank our speakers, and I would also like to thank the organizers at ACRL. We couldn't have done this if you hadn't asked us to do this. But I also want to be respectful of everybody's time. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you all have a good evening and a nice weekend.
And stay safe.
Thank you so much, Carlos, Naomi, Carrie, and Kevin. Everyone have a wonderful afternoon.